Broadcasting live from global headquarters at RP Enterprises in Greenwood, Missouri.
Stand by on this frequency.
After 22 years of entertaining FM radio listeners across the U.S., this man is the owner and executive producer of the award-winning Heartland Waterfowl on Sportsman's Channel, CEO and founder of Dumar Chemical Solutions, and the man behind the mic of Papa Ron Radio voiceovers and production. He's the man, the myth, the legend, a global icon, future Nobel Prize winner, and of course he paid me to say all this.
Really?
Literally. Welcome to the Papa Ron Podcast. Here's your host, Ronnie Phillips. Ronnie Phillips.
Hey, Happy New Year! The first podcast of 2023.
That's right.
It's going to be a good year. I'm feeling it. Of course, you know, this whole podcast was inspired because of something that happened to me just about a year ago today. In fact, I'm actually leaving for the trade show next, is that right? Next week. Yeah. I'm leaving for the trade show next week where I had the panic attack on the airplane coming back from. Where then I went to the doctor and then I was told that, hey, you got this condition called depression and anxiety and you probably ought to be medicated. And then start opening up and I start talking about it.
Right.
And then a friend hits me over the head with a folding chair like it's a WWE match and says, I've been telling you that you need to do a podcast. And here we are, episode 27. Welcome back.
How about it?
Royals broadcaster Ryan Lefevre.
Am I a regular
You
co-host
are.
now?
You
Okay.
should be.
you
should
are,
be.
Hey, by the way, the REO Speedwagon, that kind of dates all of us, right? I mean, I'm thinking, is that the audience that we're going for right now? They'll think, well, if the guy plays REO Speedwagon, he must be okay.
So a couple things there is that I found out in the process of doing this that is licensed music and is doing me no good by airing that on YouTube because there's no way now that I can be monetized. So I'm going to have to change the imaging of that here real soon if I want this thing to go anywhere. 2, I'm a huge REO Speedwagon fan. And 3, if it does get the older crowd, great. Because the older crowd, I think, is the ones that kind of grew up in a generation where you don't talk, especially men, don't talk about your emotions, don't, open up all of the stuff that you internalize all that, right? And then 3, I love you roll with the changes, right? Like I'm in my darkest moment when I was down on the ground and I was trying to figure out where I was going to go next. And it was the friends that were lifting me up and say, hey man, let's just get back in the game. Let's roll with the changes. And so there you go. That's why it's the theme song for now. But that is changing.
Not for long.
That's changing relatively soon. I got to include Jillian. And now that you're a regular host, I'm probably going to have to include your name in the imaging of this thing.
Gosh.
So anyway, part 2 with Ryan Lefevre. This is the first time we've ever done a part 2. This is the first time we've ever had someone back. And so we wanted to have Ryan back because we didn't have as much time with him as we wanted to talk about all of the things. And I was trying to think and pray about how to start this thing off because obviously the reason I wanted you here was to talk about your testimony and your story with your battle with depression and your journey with getting reacquainted with Christ. And then I got distracted with wanting to talk about baseball and that took up a majority of the episode. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about that first. Okay. We're going to talk about that, but we are going to talk about the Royals because there's a lot of things that happened with the Royals over the offseason. There's a huge conversation amongst fans in the Metro about the new ballpark.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of misconception. And I think that maybe you might be able to offer some clarity with the direction the Royals want to go with this new ballpark. And so we're going to talk all about that at some point, but hopefully we'll get to that at the end. Let's start with your journey though. But before we do that, how was your Christmas? Did you have a good celebration of Christ with the entire family?
It was great. We have 4 kids, 12, 11, 9, and 7. And boy, girl. So Christmas is a lot of fun. We still have 2 Santa believers.
Yeah.
And just in the last
Really?
3 years, I've gone from 4 to 2.
Yeah, that's quick.
But the older ones enjoy being
Get to be
part
part
of
of
the
it.
scheme now. You
How
know?
did you? So all of my kids are still believers.
Yep.
Okay, we've never had this conversation, but I probably ask you the same. How did you break it to them? And when you told them, did it crush them?
We were prepared for that because my wife grew up without Santa Claus.
Oh.
Her
Me too.
parents did not
Really?
do,
Yeah.
they did not do Santa. And so when we got married and first Christmas came along and we discussed it, and then second Christmas comes and goes, and then third Christmas, now we have a child. Now he's a baby, so he doesn't understand what's going on. But I did do Santa, and I loved Santa, and I don't feel like it got in the way of my faith. And there's feelings out there that if we lie, I say
Yep.
in quotations,
Yep.
about Santa to our kids, and the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy, are they going to feel like we're lying to them about God? So it's a good conversation, but I don't know. We probably read something online, or there's a picture that we have in our house, and it's Santa with his hat off, and he's on a knee, and he's kneeling before baby Jesus
Yes.
in the manger before he
Yes.
goes out to work, to just kind of a reminder, is this is what I'm going to do. And then I don't remember the specifics of it, but what we arrived on is that if our kids got to a point where they've figured this out, is there a Santa? And the answer is there is a Santa. It's mom and me. And there are people out there that give gifts and they don't want you to know where the gift comes from. Now you get a chance to be a Santa.
Right. We
the
did
story,
the same thing.
The story of St. Nicholas.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's where Santa Claus comes from. I mean, that's where it all began. So that's basically how we soften the blow for them, was to be honest with them, but at the same time and say, so if our kids say, is there such thing as Santa Claus? Well, absolutely. There is somebody who comes in while you're sleeping and puts presents
Yeah.
under the tree.
Yeah. But I think what you said first about, well, if we're lying to them about it, are they going to think we're lying about God? But I think on the flip side of that, something that I've talked to my kids about throughout the years is it also gives them a great picture of what it's like to believe in something you can't see. You only see the works of. So it's not trying to equate Santa Claus with God, but you believed all those years in something you never saw, but you saw the work of, you saw the results of what he did or what he's doing. So I think that's a good picture too for kids.
Yeah. So now there's Elf on a Shelf, because we didn't have
No,
that.
not for me, not at our
you guys
house.
aren't doing. Please talk to my wife.
Yeah. I've heard it's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work.
Yeah.
I got out of it a lot this year. And so I got to thank my wife for not putting that burden on me as much. And she took on a lot of that responsibility, but it's her own dang fault because she's the one to have Elf on a Shelf. Right. And so here's another thing. And my daughter is 9 and and I don't know, your daughter's here. Does she, I got to be careful on how I'm talking?
No, but she's in that weird spot where I think she knows.
Starts doing the math.
Well, that's where I was going with
has
this.
done the math and already knows like Tooth Fairy, Easter Bunny. So it's like, this is going to be the third time's a charm. The tricky thing about her is I thought this was the year. I told my husband, I'm like, I think this is the year because like next year she'll be 10 and I don't want to get made fun of and all these things. But what we did with the other two was when it happened with them is, well, now you get to be, like you said, you get to help be Santa for her. Well, now she doesn't have a younger sibling. So it's like, I didn't really think of that.
Guess you got to have another one.
Right.
Just keep them coming.
Now we do it for another family
Yeah,
who is
There
in
you go.
need or something like
Well
that.
played, Ryan.
Yeah.
Nice job.
Yeah. But so the elf,
This conversation is going on entirely too long,
I
but I just
know.
wanted to add this, that my daughter, which is good or bad or indifferent, that I don't want to allow too many people to pass judgment, but we allow her to have a shared social media account with my wife. So she can play on, and she's into dance. So she likes watching the dance videos on TikTok and stuff like that, but she'll occasionally through the feed come across something. And so she sees where somebody's talking about where your parents are Elf on a Shelf. And she's like, well, what's going on? Well, wait a minute. Let me start thinking about this. I actually did see the gift that I got in Mom's closet the other day. So maybe, Dad, is Mom Elf on a Shelf? I don't know what you're talking about.
Right,
Ask her.
right.
Yeah. Or the other day, as a matter of fact, it might still be there charging. My daughter got a Bluetooth shower speaker.
Yes.
So I brought it down here to charge, and it was having trouble charging with the actual charger. So I put it on my charger, and she's talking to my wife about it, and she was like, I don't know, it's only $5. It came from Five Below, but you mean Santa didn't give me that? oops. Well, he probably went to Five Below to get it. You know,
Right. Yeah,
So,
we've had some of those little mishaps too.
we're real
over the
close
years.
to turning the corner for the truth to come out.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move on.
Back to Jesus, right?
Right. Hey, yeah. I was just really wanting to know how your Christmas was.
Yeah,
Really. Hey, thank you for being here the first time and telling your story. And I apologize that you had to kind of summarize and through all of it. And I actually, before you came over today, I went back and I watched for the third time the video on YouTube that you did with Journey Church. But by the way, whether you watched the first episode with Ryan or this episode, I'm in the description of this podcast. I'm going to have the link to that YouTube video. You can go back and watch it, and you should, because it is so good. I wanted to ask you, after listening to that, did you talked about the relationship that you had with your mom and your dad and the 18 months that, after 18 months of being alive, that they separated, and then you kind of being an only child and trying to find your identity. So is it fair to say, or maybe you can offer some clarity, that you always battled with some sort of depression or anxiety, or was it later after you started having all the success and all the material things that you started feeling the emptiness because you felt like that all the material things and the success was ultimately going to bring you the success?
I had never thought about it that way, but as you're talking, I'm processing it. And I think that's possible. We moved a lot. I think I mentioned in our first visit that when I was done with second grade, that was my sixth school.
Right.
And so we had moved in and around the Los Angeles area. It's not like we moved from Connecticut to Tennessee to Seattle, to Oregon or whatever. I mean, it was, I was still in the greater LA area, but I was changing schools and I was changing friends. And I think being young and not knowing that was different, Jillian was talking about her daughter, about when she was doing radio from home. I mean, our kids just take in what they see. I mean, like
Their
my
normal
kid,
normal.
exactly. My kids right now are starting to realize that everyone's dad is not on television. They just think,
Right.
it's just a job to them.
Yeah.
So I think for me, I was just taking in that's just what you do. But I do think that I was forced to be outgoing because I wanted to fit in everywhere we went. But I don't think I'm that outgoing. So I think at a young age, I felt like I have to be this person to fit in. Luckily, I had sports that helped, and I had a famous father. And so I could lean on that. And I was kind of in many times with the athletic crowd because I was a good little athlete, and my dad was either playing for the Dodgers, coaching for the Dodgers, coaching for the Giants, coaching for the A's, managing the Mariners, something like that. I mean, that was kind of my in. But yeah, I think that's accurate. I think at a young age, there was probably some anxiety there. And before there was alcohol, there was just going to my identity. Hey, my dad does this or whatever.
But you don't have any memories of like laying in bed and crying and feeling like I'm so lost.
Well, I think the first thing that really opened my eyes to the brokenness when I went through my depression in 2005 was that I had an emotional detachment from my mother, which was very confusing to me because I was mostly angry at my father because they split up. He went elsewhere. I would visit him in the summers. I'd see him during the holidays, but he wasn't there. I looked up to him because it was pretty cool that he was a major leaguer.
Sure,
and as I was like 8 years old, I'm hanging out in major league ballparks, and I'm a bat boy at Dodger Stadium in front of 45,000 fans, and I'm 8 or 9 years old. I mean, so that was feeding one thing. But as I got older, I began to realize, he hasn't really put a whole lot of time into being my father here. And my mom was who I was living with. And yet at a young age, I developed some sort of emotional detachment from her. So the lying in bed that I remember at a young age was, if I ever got my heart broken by a girl, and I'm talking about going back to elementary school. I mean, how serious can a relationship be in
Right.
fourth or fifth grade? But if I felt rejected by a girl, it was devastating for me all the way up until I got married. I mean, and so I didn't really understand it. I always sought the approval of girls, romantically or otherwise. And I think even to this day, I mean, I find myself, not in a romantic way, but I still will catch myself even at my kids' school, just wanting to get to know the moms and try not to be the creepy dad along the way. And hopefully after a while they realize that I'm harmless. I'm not
Sure.
just trying to, and maybe it's because I know how hard it is to be a mom, and
Yeah.
and the dads are kind of like whatever. And I
And
understand.
of course, the guys probably, the dads want to gravitate to you
That
anyway
could be
because
part
of your profile.
Yeah, that could be part of it. So that was the early anxiety for me, was navigating what that was all about, why I needed to be accepted by girls.
So why was there, well, two questions. Why did you move around so much?
Mhm.
And you said the first 6 years.
Mhm.
And two, why was there an emotional detachment?
Well, we moved, let's see, when my parents were divorced, my mom had to move just because, she had to go back to work and support us. So we went somewhere where she could support just the two of us. Then she was remarried, and so we moved to another part of LA because of that.
Okay.
That relationship didn't work, so we moved again. So
Gotcha.
there was more than one school within each move. So that was part of it. And I think the emotional detachment was, my mom was young when this happened. And she was in her, late 20s, early 30s. And this was a time long, long before there was public gossip about divorces and things like that. But for whatever reason, the way my mom's explained it to me, back in the mid 70s, when Jim Lefevre and Jean Lefevre split up, it was news in Los Angeles. And it was just that this was way before Entertainment Tonight and TMZ and all that kind of stuff. But for some reason, that was news. And
Was
my
she
mom,
a high profile person?
not as much as my father, but we're talking about Los Angeles. This is Hollywood. So it was the Dodgers, but it was bigger than the Dodgers because it was Los Angeles.
Okay.
And so, and if my mom was sitting here right now, she could tell you all the reporters and newscasters that talked about it way back in the 70s. She's still angry about that. So when my dad left, she was young, she was angry, and that played out into her social life. And so there were things that I was exposed to at a very young age that I wouldn't say would be something that the police would come and take me away, but because of the party she was having and the company that she was keeping or whatever, at a very young age, I felt unsafe. And even though she was in the same house, I felt emotionally detached.
Wow. Okay.
And it wasn't until that I was an adult and really began to examine my manhood and that it wasn't all about, my job and how much money I was making and all the things that I had, that deep inside of every man is this desire to be connected to their mother,
Sure.
to be held by their mother, to be in their mother's arms.
Yeah.
I remember going to Rome this was a year after my depression, and just like, I got to go see the world. I was raised Catholic, and I wanted to go to Rome. I wanted to see the Vatican. And I remember going into the Sistine Chapel and just taking in the artwork and going into the Vatican and the theme that just kept coming up, and especially inside of the cathedral, was this Michelangelo, not statue. Help me out here.
I don't know, the ceiling or the
No.
statue?
I want to say a statue, but
Okay.
we'll just use statue.
Okay.
But a statue of Mary holding Jesus after she took him off the cross.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And it was a Michelangelo creation. And
Gotcha.
Depiction?
I remember. I'm
still trying to get the words.
I know. I don't
So
know.
was
why-
it
I
the
don't-
Stations of the Cross or
No, it
something?
was. I don't know why I don't want to use the word statue. Like, what would
Okay.
you describe David, the statue? Well, the statue of David.
yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
so
So it's a
it was a statue. I guess I'm trying to think of a more artsy way to say statue.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
But basically, it's right when you walk in
Yeah.
to the cathedral, and to the right, there's this huge statue of Mary holding Jesus' dead body after they took him off the cross. And I never forget the feeling that I had. This is a grown man dead, but being held by his mother.
Yeah.
And it was men who were standing there looking at it. And I was connecting dots at that point with my own emotional detachment with my mother. She and I had a long conversation. We processed through it. There was healing because of that. She understood it. I understood it. I understood a lot of bad decisions I made over the course of my life that was tied to that. But I remember looking at that and just having this emotional reaction to it and realizing that women weren't standing around looking at this. It was men. And that there was just this desire to be held. And at the very end, he was held in his mother's arms. And then watching the Passion of the Christ when that came out, you know, and the scene that grabbed me the most was when Mary's when Jesus is being flogged and on his way to be crucified, she's having flashbacks of his life. And one of them is when he skins his knee and he's crying, and she drops everything and just comes running for him, you know? And it was just like, I forget, I think I was listening to Christian radio, and someone was giving an early review of that and saying that was the scene that was most emotional for men. So there was just all this stuff going on inside of me that I was processing and realized that I missed out on that emotional detachment. And when the alcohol was gone and the depression was gone and the dust had settled, and I could realize that there was a need there I spent most of my life trying to impress my father, but in my young formative years, I needed an emotional attachment with my mother.
So how did you fix that, or how did you get past it, or did you? I mean, as you said, there was healing, but I mean, those spots couldn't really be filled by her, I would imagine, at that point.
Well, my mom, you know, like everyone in her generation, was raised by parents who went through the Depression and World War II, and there was a very courageous part of that generation, but also it was a very hard generation. There was a hardness of heart where people just didn't really talk about what was going on. And there was so much going on in the world during that time, but you just kind of put your head down and you just kind of move forward. So my mom was raised in a generation where there just wasn't really a lot of discussion about that. So I think it meant something to her, but what I had to do, they were living in New Mexico at the time, and she and I went for a hike, and we sat down, and I had to share this
is
with
after
her.
you returned from Rome?
This was before I went to Rome.
Okay.
And I sat there, and I don't know how much it meant to her, but I needed to tell her what I had learned and that I forgave her. And it was more emotional for me than it was for her. It meant something to her, but I also don't know if it connected for her as much as it connected for me. You know, somebody told me something years ago, which I use now so often when I think about my own pain and other people's pain and how they deal with pain. Someone said, if you took 2 Coke bottles that are the exact same size, the exact same weight, they came out of the same machine, and you hold them the same distance from the ground and you drop them to the ground, they're going to break differently. And that was a way to illustrate that we all break differently. You know, we may look the same. We may have been raised by the same parents and have the same siblings and went to the same school in the same environment, whatever, but we all break differently. So had I said that to her 5 years prior to that, I may not have had the healing that I needed, because I would want her to break more and feel it and understand it. But it was a good time for me to share that with her, because I just don't know exactly what it meant to her. But the forgiveness was complete for me, that instead of just saying in prayer or whatever, well, I forgive her, I'll let her go, but to actually look in her eyes and explain to her my feelings, some of it brought upon by myself, but look in her eyes and tell you, I forgive you.
Did she understand it, or do you think she was confused at first?
I think she understood some of it, but I think she was also, I don't know if she was confused. She didn't fully understand it. And I think even to this day, she would probably say that she doesn't fully understand it. But, but she's not responsible for that.
No.
I mean, that's my hurt, my deal. Going back to the Coke bottles again, I could have had a twin brother who went through exactly what I went through and just was able to get through it. But, my heart was wired differently and it was injured differently. But that was big for me, because at that point, by forgiving her, now every dumb thing I did that had to do with the emotional detachment from my mother was on me.
Right.
She's off the hook.
Yeah.
I think it is confusing, though, for people, and even for people that if you've never forgiven someone without being asked for forgiveness first, I think that's really foreign to a lot of people. I think most people think, okay, the first step is, if I've hurt you, I'm supposed to come to you first and say, will you forgive me? And then you make the next step and you decide, yes, I'll forgive you. And we all hug and we're all happy. But I think it's so foreign. I mean, it was foreign to me before I did it. And the first time I did it, verbally to someone, it felt really weird to say, I just want you to know that I forgive you. And they're like,
That's a really,
I mean, it's kind of like this weird, like, because sometimes you explain it and sometimes you don't, and I mean, I'm sure they're left with questions if they don't ask and you don't tell what you're forgiving them for. It's just an odd thing.
that's a good point. That might have been some of the awkwardness or whatever
Yeah,
that,
it's
she wasn't
strange.
asking for my forgiveness, and yet I'm
Right.
granting it to her anyway. And I struggle with that too, Jillian. I mean, from what I read in the Bible, I mean, Jesus is usually referring to if your brother comes to you and asks you for forgiveness, then we get into the 7 times 70 and how many times you've forgiven, all that, that it is much easier when we forgive when somebody asks for our forgiveness.
Right.
Wow. You had talked about in that video with Journey Church. I'm so sorry. Feel like I don't know if it's the sinuses or whatever, but I can't feel like I can.
Well, I can't
losing my
figure out
voice.
what a statue is. So, yeah.
Thanks for bailing me out
We're
there.
all struggling today
Yeah.
in our own
When I
ways.
was watching the Journey sermon, you had talked about this is going to
Sculpture.
sculpture. There you
Thank
go.
you.
Okay, that's the scientific,
Okay.
artistic term
Do you
that you
feel
were
better?
looking for.
I feel better now.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
He's free.
I have no idea what we've been talking about. Now that I know that I said sculpture, okay, now we can get into this.
Oh my God.
I want to just maybe one more time, hit on the relationship with your mother, because I felt like that in that video, I had seen or heard you say that in the process of maybe going through therapy or having a life coach, that you included your mother in that journey. Did I hear that correctly?
Well, at this point, even though I hadn't fully arrived at the issues that I had with her, we had become close as I had gotten older, which made the whole thing even more confusing, because wait a minute, my problems have to do with this emotional attachment with my mother, and yet she raised me. My father was mostly absent, and yet now we're friends as adults, and I call her and I see her and I love her. So wait a minute, I got this. This is very confusing to me.
Sure.
But she had been through clinical depression twice. Once when I was in high school and once when I was in college, and I had no idea what she was going through because I thought our life was pretty good.
Right.
And but then again, I was out drinking, so if I ever felt depressed, that was my medication, and I can go out and do stupid things and just kind of suppress all those feelings. I didn't really understand. So when I went through what I went through, the first person I called was my mother. And my book begins with me talking about being in my closet of my house in Kansas City at 34 years old, having achieved everything basically that I wanted to before I turned 30. And then at age 34, I'm lying in my closet in a fetal position, calling out for the comfort of my mother. Here we go back to the emotional detachment with my mother. And so I call her the night after that breakdown, and she mothered me, nursed me through it. I would call her 2 or 3 times a day. She flew into Kansas City before they moved here. She flew into Kansas City.
Oh, they live here now?
They live here now.
Oh, that's great.
And so we would stay up all night, and having been through what she's been through, she could relate. She knew the language. She knew how to say, how are you feeling right now? And get me to just express all these irrational feelings that I was having and help me kind of process through that, because that's how she got through what she went through. So that she was a huge part of my recovery, because as I'm sorting out this underlying issue with my mother is being the mother that I always wanted her to be, to help me get through what I was going through.
Wow.
You got anything?
No,
And I remember this too. I
big.
remember when
That's
I
big. That's
remember
heavy.
when I remembered that I needed to go, and I say go home. I grew up in Los Angeles, and they were living in New Mexico. But when I came to the conclusion that I'm trying to fill this hole with girlfriends and hopefully a wife, that I just need to go and be with my mom and express this to her. I remember I was at an event here in Kansas City, and my date, who was supposed to be my date, backed out of it, and we were dating at the time, and it was time for this relationship to be over. I was just so needy, and I think she just wanted to date me because she was needy too, and one of us needed to end the relationship. And I remember driving home and just saying, I need to go see my mom. And I called her and I said, can I come to your house tomorrow? And I got on a flight from Kansas City to New Mexico, and I just thought about her the whole way. And I remember landing in Albuquerque, getting off the plane, and my mom had been going through this with me, and I told her I just needed to come and spend time with her, living with my stepfather and my brother in New Mexico. And I got off the plane, and I could see her down the hall as I was getting off the plane. I was walking toward her, and I remember, I'll never forget, I wrote about this in my book. She just looked at me, and she kind of tilted her head, like, and kind of put her hands at her sides. And I literally, like, my last 4 or 5 steps, like, I just kind of, like, I'm 34 years old. Like, I ran to her and just hugged her and just cried on her shoulder for like 2 minutes straight in the middle of the airport. And then for the next 3-4 days, I just followed her around wherever she went. I mean, I was like 5 or 6 years old again. If she was in real estate at the time, if she had to go do a showing, I just went with her. If she had to go to the store, I just went with her. Like, it was almost like an umbilical cord. I just needed to be connected to her. And so and that's when we had the hike and I had the conversation. Forgiving. But it was
that was a real pivotal
huge
trip.
Huge. And and I think it was for her too, that she, I'm sure if there was part of her, she would admit that we missed out on in those turbulent early years when she was trying to figure out what she was going to do as a single mother now, and everyone knowing that she's divorced from her famous husband and whatever. And so that was, big moment.
What kind of conversations did you have with your dad? I mean, when your dad is a professional athlete and a professional manager and an icon, fair to say? At
that time. Well, I don't know. I mean, well known, I'll say.
Yeah. Okay. So, he's kind of, he's the guy with the armor shield, right? Like, you said you had more of an uncle-like relationship with him than your dad. When you got to a vulnerable state to where, how did that conversation look?
Well, he read the book.
So he read the book before he knew anything about any of this?
I think I sent both my parents a copy of it before it was published. I mean, I didn't want to be, like Prince Harry, and just like empty my dirty laundry on my family without letting them know.
Gosh.
So I let them both read the manuscript, before it went to print. And I just said, look, I'm writing this. And I make it clear in the book, look, I'm not here to tell you that my parents are bad people. They were doing the best they could.
Sure.
But this is what happened to me, and I needed to go fix this. This isn't on them. But at the same time, if I'm going to tell my story, I can't tell my story and say that I had a strained relationship with my mother and my father. That doesn't help anybody connect to the story. I needed to be more specific so that they could go, oh yeah, I had the same thing, or I had almost the exact same thing happen to me. I mean, that's really, by being vulnerable in that way, I mean, that's how we connect. And then someone can look at me just like I can look at someone else and say, well, he got through that. He's okay now. Someone can maybe look at me and say, well, he got past that, but this is what he had to deal with. I got more resistance from my mom, to be honest, than my dad. And I was very honest about my dad. My dad and I have never had the conversation like my mom and I have, but he knows, he's aware, and he didn't have any objection with what the manuscript said. And if anything, I recall him saying, I learned a lot about our relationship by reading this.
Your dad's still alive, right?
Yeah.
Right.
He just turned 81.
Okay. You haven't had any in-depth conversation about that whole journey?
Not really.
You don't have any desire? I mean, you were, and granted, you kind of clarified about the confusion of having the issue with your mother when she was the one who was actually kind of the care, the one that was there for you and nurtured you. But being that he was the person that he was, the stature of the man that he was, you never had any desire to have like a come to Jesus with him?
I don't think our relationship dictated that. I don't think he needed to know that, because we're not around each other every day. Fortunately, God has put a lot of father figures into my life. So when life happens, he's not at the top of the list that I go seek counsel from. I mean, that's just the dynamic that myself and my half siblings just were raised with. I mean, that's just the way that it is. And I didn't want to, if he didn't want to talk about it, I didn't want to bombard it with it. Now, It was different for my mom because she was walking through this whole thing with me.
Sure.
And I felt like to finish tying the bow on this thing, I needed to say, hey, there's something else that I need to tell you, because I was much closer with her than I am with him. So I don't want to burden him. He doesn't need to feel my pain. I need to deal with my pain. And I don't know if I shared this or not the first time we were together. I just read this recently, and it's just opened my eyes to so many different things. But Winston Churchill once said, if you find yourself going through hell,
Yes.
keep going.
Yeah. Keep swinging.
And it's, it's a real manly thing to say, but it made me realize when I look back on what I went through, if I were to take any credit, I mean, I'm not going to boast. I boast only in the Lord. But if I were to take credit for the action that I took, I kept going. I didn't want to keep going, but I kept going. And so we have three choices when we're walking through hell. We get halfway there and we can't take it anymore. And we turn around and we go back, right? And we say, I'm never going through that again. I mean, for many people, the cure is more painful than the disease. So I'm not going there. I've gotten a glimpse of it, and I'm not going there again. Some people will choose to make hell their comfort zone, their familiar zone, and they will sit there, and whoever is willing to listen to what's going on in their lives, they're going to tell you about it over and over again, and it's never getting any better. And so I didn't want to be that guy that I just sat there and my dad needs to understand what I went through. He needs to understand. And then choice 3 is that you just keep going. And so when I got to the other side, it was like, okay, in the big picture, this is between Jesus and me. And if my dad wants to ask me specifics about it, I'll share it with him and hopefully not shame him by, what I missed out on. And who's to say that I'm going to be a way better father than he was? I mean, now it's on me. I have to raise my boys with the information that I have better than I was raised, and hopefully my boys raise their boys better than I raised them. I mean, that's the goal. So now, my wife, my closest friends, our counselor, and Jesus. I mean, those are the people that I go to if I have issues, unless somebody comes to me with what they're going through. Now I have a story to share with them.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, if you said you were raised Catholic, so was that your mom or your dad or both?
That was my dad's mom. I wouldn't say my dad, my dad's side of the family. Yeah.
Okay. So is your mom?
She was raised Lutheran. So, I mean, they're pretty close.
They're pretty close.
They're on each side of the Reformation, but they're cousins.
Exactly. Well, and then there are people who will still argue that Martin Luther died a Catholic priest. So all he did for Christianity doesn't count because whatever. Anyway, I'm just curious if your testimony, your story has affected either of their faith. Like if you can see anything that has opened their eyes to anything as far as their relationship with Christ, or...
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I know my dad has had periods of time in his life in his 70s and 80s where he'll tell me that he's been going to church, and for a while he lived in San Diego, and Mike Sweeney lives in San Diego, and Mike Sweeney was a huge influence on me. And Mike would take him to mass, and so I would hear about that and what that meant to him. My mom found a Lutheran church in Lee Summit that she goes to. My stepfather reconnected with his Catholic background, and I think there's also a part of them that because they were raised differently in more of a routine generation of you go to church and you do this on this date and you do that there wasn't really the personal relationship, reading the Bible, what Jesus actually said, not what the priest says that Jesus said or the pastor says that Jesus said, but really getting into the Bible and trying to live the gospel entirely and not just the easy parts, but to just and to be constantly searching for what's the hole in my life now? What am I holding on to that I'm not willing to give over to Christ? I think that's still foreign to them. I mean, I think, and I learned this in my own walk, that I was treating God as my accountant, and that in the end, if I had more, if I'm saving more than I'm giving, and I still have a balance at the end of the day, that's good enough, right? And I had to realize that no, that's not good enough. If I'm not constantly trying to grow in Him and find my blind spots and allow Him to expose my blind spots, that this journey doesn't come to an end until I stand before him. But it's a generational thing.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think a lot of people, and I will put myself in this place that sometimes that God's more of a fallback on than a lean on. So it's a fallback when I hit a rough spot. And that's when I'm going to talk to God. And that's when I'm going to pray. I'm going to fall back and go, oh, this is you know how some people will say, well, all we can do now is pray. Well, that should be the first, right? That, I mean, if you're facing something, not like, well, you know, if it's a health thing and, all the doctors, we've done all the tests. And so I guess all we can do now is pray. Right. Well, that is true, but hopefully we're doing that all along.
Yeah.
So to lean into him in the moving forward, in the good times and the bad times, instead of just, when something's bad, I'm going to fall into his arms and beg for whatever you need.
And that was me for a long time.
Yeah.
Oh, me too.
Yeah, for sure.
I think it is a lot of people. In fact,
I do too.
I've tried to do better, even starting as of recently. We probably know the YouVersion
Bible app.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bible app. And so you can go on there and you can let that thing, as you're driving down the road, read the Bible to you.
Yes.
And so I've started with the new year, try to start to be a new me. And instead of only praying when I'm in trouble or feeling bad, like, hey, I'm going to try to educate myself and do a better job. Like, I'm so much better than I was a year ago, but I still have a long road ahead of me. And I think that is one step in the direction to help continue to grow. I'm going to ask a tough question, and I'm really, if I'm just being honest, not comfortable asking this question, but there is a similarity between you and I outside of the depression, because I also grew up Catholic and I no longer attend a Catholic church. And I don't want this to become a debate about one denomination being better than the other. But I sometimes feel shamed, maybe is a strong word, for, either from, someone who knew that I was Catholic and left the Catholic church, or from somebody who knows me in my new church, knows I was Catholic, and I still have a very strong, soft place in my heart for Catholicism.
Sure. Yeah.
You said in your video, in that journey video, that sometimes when you talk to Catholics, that the story is, I was raised Catholic, I went to a Catholic church, but...
Yeah, right.
And you phrased it as, I grew up in the Catholic church and.
Correct. Yeah.
Can you elaborate on where you're at with your belief or feeling of the Catholic faith or Catholicism? Because you're not attending a Catholic church now.
Right. Well, the easy answer to that question is it's not the church. Are people learning about Jesus and relating to Jesus? Is Jesus in the forefront of that church? Because we can get caught up in which denomination is better than the other, which one's more accurate. There are Catholic churches that inspire believers to have a relationship with Jesus. As the one that I raised in, I was around priests in high school. I really didn't have a solid Catholic experience, if you will, until I went to high school. I went to an all-boys Catholic high school in Los Angeles, similar to Rockhurst here in Kansas City.
Okay.
And I was surrounded by priests who really didn't give off this aura of that it was about the Catholic Church. It was about Jesus, and this is how Catholics celebrate Jesus. So it wasn't until, to be honest, it wasn't until I came to the Midwest, and I got a little taste of it when I was in Minnesota, because it's a very Lutheran strong part of the country. And then especially when I came to Kansas City, when I came to the Bible Belt, I mean, it wasn't until then that I thought that, people don't even think that Catholics are Christians. And so I became this little Catholic apologist, if you will, because I would take these accusations or these assumptions about the Catholic Church, and I would take it to a Catholic priest and say, well, what about this?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there are certain things that are in the Catholic Church, honoring the saints, honoring Mary. And I use the word honoring because some Catholics take it too far and they start worshiping the saints and they start worshiping Mary. But, there's certain beliefs in catechism that may not completely line up with the Bible, but they're not essentials. Jesus came, he is the only Son of God, and he came here to die for the redemption of our sins so that we may spend eternity with him. That's the essential. Now, how that plays itself out, looks different in even Protestant churches, charismatic churches, evangelical churches. You're going to have pastors that are going to veer off the road and have their followers under the banner of charismatic evangelical church that they're really not following the exact words of Jesus. I had a great experience in the Catholic Church. My introduction to Jesus and faith and prayer was in the Catholic Church. And as I grew and experienced other churches, and then I married a non-Catholic, and I realized very quickly that, Sarah's faith was much deeper than mine and much more ingrained in her over the course of her whole life than mine, that the comfort that I felt, and I say comfort because, if a non-Catholic goes to Catholic Mass, it's very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
The routine and the rituals, there's really not an explanation as to why we're standing and why we're kneeling, and all the Catholics have all these prayers memorized, and it's not up on a screen that you can read. It's a very uncomfortable experience for a non-Catholic.
Yeah.
And so I realized early on that, we were not going to be a Catholic family, and I was okay with that because at that point, it was about my relationship with Jesus.
Yeah.
So, just right here in Lee Summit, I was a member of Holy Spirit Catholic Church, which is on the north side of 150 Highway in Lee Summit. Now I go to Journey Church International,
South side.
which is right across the street from Holy Spirit. And for some people, unfortunately, they think that we're not across the street from each other. We're a million miles away from each other.
Right.
And having experienced both and having experienced people in both, I don't think you should feel guilty about that because your loyalty is not to a man in Rome. Your loyalty is not to a beautiful old building in Kansas City with stained glass windows. They might be formative parts of your faith. You are beholden to Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And Jesus Christ can be found in any church in the United States.
Yeah. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, and I was just going to say, I've kind of come to a realization over the last few years that any faith that believes in God and believes that Jesus is our Savior, pick any one of their churches, any given Sunday or Saturday or whatever. There are going to be people in it that will be in heaven and people in it that won't, because it's really about their heart and their relationship. So
Enter through the narrow gate.
Exactly. So there'll be Catholics and there'll be Lutherans and there'll be Methodists and there'll be Journey Churchers.
Yeah.
I don't know what the denomination is and I love that so many churches now don't necessarily plaster on the side of the building what the denomination is, because I think that's so important that that's not what's important,
Right.
So
That makes me feel like it's more about the church and the business of the church than it is about Jesus.
Well, I was just
did that
curious.
help?
Yeah, it does. No, it does.
And I still have that. I still have that in me, Ronnie. If you were to ask me what would be my retreat right now, and I haven't been a regularly practicing Catholic in a long time. On the road, I will go to daily mass because in a lot of places we stay downtown and there'll be a big, big cathedral or whatever downtown, and I'll go to daily mass. because those are my roots. I'm not.
Do you go to communion?
Since
you've kind of left.
This is my personal belief. I will go to communion because I want to receive the body and blood of Jesus. And I think Jesus wants me to receive him and use that as a symbol as to how I am supposed to behave for the rest of that day. That's my daily bread. How do I get through today? I use that as inspiration. My wife doesn't often come with me to mass, but if she does, I won't. If they won't allow her to take it, I won't take it.
Okay.
And my wife has been a missionary all her life to the poor in third world countries all around the world. And if someone's going to tell her that she can't have the body and blood of Christ in their building, then I'm not going to take the body and blood of Christ in their building. But if you were to ask me, what's my retreat? I would go up to Conception Abbey in Northwest Missouri. And spend time with the monks and hear them chant the Psalms in the Basilica. That's still home for me. That's where I feel like that's still God's presence to me. I've grown to love and listen all the time to contemporary Christian music, worship music, which, drums and electric guitars.
Not a thing in the Catholic Church.
That was a shock. That was a shock to
still is for
the
me.
Little old lady playing the organ, and she also happens to be the only one that's really singing. Everyone else is just kind of humming along with her. Now people have their hands in the air and they're singing, they're worshiping. That's become normal to me. It was a shock at first, but in my bones, I would be in the basilica at Conception Abbey listening to the monks chant the Psalms. I mean,
can
that's
relate.
That's just my DNA.
And you spent a long period of time there. Is that right? Is that part of your story? I think that was from, I don't know if that was something I saw in that interview maybe?
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah. So talk about I actually have it down here on my notes. You spending some time up there at Conception Abbey with the monks at the monastery. So was that through the process of everything that you were going through and you knowing that you needed to get back on track with Jesus, and you just kind of had to put all of the distractions and noise aside and be in a place in order to like this to do that? Was that, did somebody give you some sort of advice or guidance there, or did you premeditate? Did you think to yourself, that's where I want to go? Or did you research, where can I go? Where's a monastery I can go to?
Well, my high school principal, who eventually became a Catholic bishop, we have a very close relationship. And in my recovery, he was a bishop in Mandeville, Jamaica, which is up in the mountains of Jamaica. And he invited me as I was coming through my depression in 2005 to come visit with him. And it was very much like a Tuesdays with Maury type experience where I went up there for about a week and we just sat and we talked. And he had to do all of his bishop duties during the day, and I was just retreating in his home up there. And then at night he'd come back, we'd have dinner, and we would just talk. And I wrote a lot about that in my book, the things that I learned from him. And he had known me since high school. I mean, we had this relationship. So he was like this person that I would go to, and we still have a relationship. And then you remember the British comedian Tony Hendra? Does that name ring a bell?
It doesn't.
What was the British movie, the comedy about the rock band, 70s, 80s? Has nothing to do with a sculpture. Anyway.
I don't know.
The rock band. Like the old with Mark Wahlberg and Jennifer Aniston. Is that the movie?
No,
That's a different movie. Okay.
Boy, I'm terrible with my details today. But anyway, Tony Hendra wrote this book called Father Joe, and he went to a Catholic school in Great Britain, and there was a monk priest that was there, and over the course of his life, he would go back, and he was kind of living as a wild celebrity and here, both in the United States and in Great Britain. But when he needed to get grounded and centered again, he would go back and talk to Father Joe, and he would talk about what the monastery was like and how they would take a walk together and all this. And it just fascinated me. And so a priest friend of mine who actually married Sarah and me, Father Paul Turner, who actually is the pastor at the cathedral downtown Kansas City, when we became friends, he graduated from Conception Seminary, and we were talking. He said, well, you should go up there with me sometime. So I went up there and got to know a bunch of the monks. And for years, I'd go up there during the All-Star break, and I would go up there for years. And then when the season was over, I would go up there for a week just before I would go into the off season. And I would just, they gather 6 times a day to pray, to sing, and then they go about their work, and the bells ring. I mean, it's right out of a movie. The bells ring, and all the monks, they get in line, they come back in the basilica, and they read their psalms. They chant the psalms to each other, and they go about their business for a couple of hours. Then the bells ring, and they gather again. And the rhythm of it is just such a good reminder that they don't ever want to get too far into their day before they stop everything and gather and pray again, and remember who they're working for. And so now, being married with 4 kids, I mean, I haven't been up there for a few years, but I'm still friends with a lot of the monks, and so that's my retreat.
Interesting
place.
So when you started going up there, was this 2006 or shortly after?
This is Spinal Tap. Tony Hendra was this in Spinal Tap.
I almost said Monty Python only because I was like, that's one thing I've never understood is Monty Python.
This has become like a Saturday Night Live.
This is really
like you're doing an interview, and then like 10 minutes later, the guy answers a question from 10 minutes ago.
Well, the next time this happens, I'm going to say, don't worry about it, Ryan. It'll come to you in just a little bit.
Exactly.
We can have a little game where we guess how long is it going to take for Ryan to get the answer, and will he just randomly blurt it out?
In the new world of gambling, we can set the over and under.
For sure.
Minutes. So the question is, how shortly after you, in 2005 is when you came out with your depression, right? Or you were going through the meat of that depression. How soon after that did you go to the monastery? And you said for years. How many years would you say afterwards were you continuing to go up there?
Well, my depression, the meat of the depression, the book, mostly talks about the summer of 2005. I was up there in the spring of 2006.
Okay.
And then up until I was married, I proposed to my wife up there. I had a moment when I realized that I had gone to Mass up there, and the priest was preparing for communion. And in the Catholic Church, unlike the Protestant Church, the Catholic Church, when they give communion, that they don't just believe that this is symbolic of the body and blood of Christ, but there's a ritual they go through where it becomes
The body,
yes.
body and blood of
Yes.
Christ.
Yes.
And whether you want to believe that or not, I don't know if that's essential, but basically Jesus laid hands on the apostles. Peter's considered the first pope
Yes.
in the Catholic Church. Popes lay their hands on bishops. Bishops lay their hands on priests. So, I mean, in the Catholic faith, there's, that the priest that gives you communion, there is a lineage of laying of hands that goes all the way back to Jesus, which is pretty cool.
Yeah,
And
I think so too.
So anyway, the priest, Father Albert, was talking about not just communion, but just the altar, because communion is blessed on an altar in the Catholic Church, and how in biblical times a gift would be presented to the altar. It would be blessed by the priest, received by God, returned to the people sanctified, and then they would consume this sanctified gift that they had presented to God. And so that's what communion is, and I remember it like it was yesterday. Father Albert said, so as you approach the table, as you approach the body and blood of Christ today, ask yourself, what are you willing to leave on the altar today? Walk away from it and trust that God will receive it, bless it, and return it to you in a way that maybe you've never imagined.
Wow.
And so I'm at the monastery with a girl that I was dating, and it hit me, and I needed to go for a walk. So I went for a walk around the monastery. I was going around, it's called Placid Lake up there, not to be confused with Lake Placid from
in
the
New York.
1980 Olympics. Yeah. Walking around Placid Lake, and I realized that God was saying, you have trusted me with a lot of things in your life. You have not trusted me with who your future wife is going to be. And I'm asking you, will you give that to me and allow me to bless it and give it back to you in a way that you may not even imagine? And I realized I needed to break up with this girl, and I needed at least 1 year where I didn't date anybody, because I was just trying so hard, the next relationship. And she's a wonderful, wonderful lady, but it was just this next forced relationship because, that was the next thing for me, to be married. And I realized I need to end this relationship, and I need to date God for a year and not date anybody else for 1 year.
Wow.
And here's how the enemy works. As soon as I realized that's what I needed to do, I had headphones on. I didn't realize that this girl had gone for a jog, and as soon as I was resolved to do this, she ran by me and kind of tapped me on the shoulder, and as she ran by, she looked over her shoulder and gave me this $1 million smile. And I was like, here's the enemy, came right away. And
Yeah.
like, but how do you break up with her, right? So we ended the relationship, and I gave God 1.5 years, and I proposed to my wife on that same spot.
Oh man.
So
Wow.
yeah.
Did you tell that girl why you were breaking up with her? 'Cause
Yeah.
if everything
How did
was
that
fine,
I did.
like
I did.
you did.
I did.
How'd
I said,
that
I'm
go
not.
over?
I said this is the whole. This is not you. It's me. But I said I am
not you,
not.
it's
I
God.
am not in a place to be dating anybody. And by the way, you will not find out that I started dating someone else 2 months from now. It'll be at least a year. I got to clear my head, and I got to figure. I got to get right with God.
How long were you with this person? And how
Couple
did they
months.
take-
Yeah,
so-
it wasn't a long relationship.
Okay.
Yeah. So
So
and that was the first time I kissed my wife too, by the way. I realized I decided if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this right this time. And so I kissed my wife. I did not kiss my wife until I proposed to her on that spot. And
Really?
Didn't kiss her again until I said I do.
what?
Yeah.
How long were you dating before you proposed? And then how long between proposal and wedding?
Yeah.
We were friends for 4.5 years.
Yeah.
Really close friends for that 1.5 years. God brought her back into my life during that 1.5 years. And she knew what I was going through.
Right.
And we already established a friendship at that point. So there really wasn't a question with boundaries or anything like that. But when I asked her, I did it the old-fashioned way, the way our grandparents tell us and the way I think Scripture tells us. But I asked her permission to date her with the intent of marrying her.
Wow.
So that this isn't just like, hey, let's date, let's be boyfriend, girlfriend. Like, my intention is to marry you. And these are my strict physical boundaries. And she accepted it. And so we dated for 2 months. I mean,
Okay.
we knew everything about
Can
each
you-
other.
Yeah,
Can
you didn't
you-
need a
we
long
proposed-
courtship, right?
We dated for 2 months and I proposed. And then 2 months after that, we got married. So we went from friends to married in 4 months.
Wow.
That's a whole nother episode. But
Well,
Sounds
we
like
got
a
it.
movie.
let's
Make a movie.
Let's find your calendar and let's see what you got left. What's
Oh.
that? Let's go ahead. Sorry.
I have to go get kids.
Oh, you're on your way out the door. You got to leave.
Yeah.
Oh, shoot.
Yep.
Okay. Like right now,
Yeah.
you do need to leave right
Yeah.
now.
I wasn't
Okay.
looking at the
Doggone it. I wasn't aware that we were on a time frame.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we're not going to talk about the Royals.
That's all right.
Doggone it.
all right.
Well, maybe we can try to do this again some other time. I don't know. Well, thank you, man. I really do appreciate
Yeah,
you
thank
taking
you
the
so
time
much.
to come in. And I really appreciate you opening up about your story. And again, if anybody's listening to this and is struggling with any kind of mental illness, whether it be depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, know that you're not alone. And one of the things that I love that you said at the end of the episode that we did with you last time was, have you thanked God for what you're going through? And I never really thought about it like that.
whatever you ask for from God, whatever you ask, as the Bible says, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it
Yes.
and it will be yours.
Yes.
And I think people, when they think of prayer, I'm praying to God, and then when he gives it to me, then I will be grateful.
Yeah.
And I've learned, and we can do a whole episode on answered prayer in my life to the day. I mean, 5 years to the day, 10 years to the day, 20 years to the day, prayers answered that God reminded me, I didn't forget about your prayer. But when I say that, and I don't know what people are going through when I say something like that, but if you believe in a sovereign God who made a personal decision to create you with a purpose,
Yep.
and that he doesn't waste our pain, that our pain has a purpose in his greater story, then whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it and it will be yours. So if you can believe that you will receive it someday, then when trials come, can you begin by thanking God?
I love it. Real quick, you did mention last time you were here that you will be in a church speaking in Blue Springs. What's the date? Share all of that information as we are recording this podcast on January 11th of 2023.
Blue Springs Assembly on January 22nd.
Okay. And it will be the same kind of
It's,
story that
I'll talk about my story, but I really do focus in on how God has answered prayers in my life in some pretty miraculous ways.
Okay. Yeah. You do touch on some of that in the visit that you did with Journey Church. Again, that link is in the description of this podcast, and it sounds like you're going to share a few more of those stories there. So once again, man, really, really, really appreciate you taking the time to come down the street, because I know that you're within walking distance, I think you said, not very far, of RP Enterprises Global Headquarters. So thank you again. I hope that we get to do this more often, because I always feel like that there's so much to cover and so much to talk about. And I imagine we won't get the chance to do this before spring training. So have a great season, man.
Yeah.
We'll have a great season.
I've had a great time visiting with you and Jillian. So thank you, Ronnie. I really appreciate it.
We
Thank
appreciate
you.
you having me here. That's episode 28 of the Papa Ron Podcast with Ryan Lefevre.
You've been listening to the Papa Ron Podcast. If you enjoyed this show, hit subscribe now and tell your friends on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, and other social platforms. To participate on the show, leave a message with your comments or questions by calling or texting 816-558-6389. That's 816-558-6389. Until next time, thanks for listening to the Papa Ron Podcast. Papa Ron Podcast.